the river. A crow-shaped shadow flies across the river. Juna knows that her daughter is coming, so the right thing to do is to make her favourite feed. Juna casts a fishing net over the river with her mind. The net drifts onto the surface, slips under the skin, and is swallowed by the water. The net descends through the deep water slowly, resting on the bed. River grass unflattens and pokes up between the spaces. Juna sings a song to attract fish to the area. The bulging tide turns the river over like a slow screw, and the net follows, one corner lifting and twisting over and over itself like a tight-rolled cigarette. Pulling the corners of the net together, Juna tugs it back into her mind. It is heavy with water and fish. Inside her skull, she unrolls the net and 5 dirty silver brim, a deep charcoal catfish, and a dove grey nurse shark begin to flop and bounce. The shark bares its teeth, its black eyes not giving anything away. She inhales the shark and catfish and smaller brim into her throat and then breathes them out with a force so sharp they fly through the walls of her skull, through the window, and splash back into the river. While they're all busy reorienting themselves, the shark eats the catfish and swims away from the haunted place. The 3 remaining brim flop heavier and less frequently, embodying all the drama of dying. The exertion of gasping weighs on their bodies, the way Juna feels when she breathes in her body. The fish stop jumping, shuddering to a shivering and then a stillness. She imagines that this is the way her lungs will stop working inside her comatose form. Gracie enters her mother's room. In her huge soft bed beside the window, Judah is cradled in sunlight. Gracie prowls over to the bed. "Hey, Mum," Gracie's voice catches. "Long time no see." Gracie inhales. The room is musty. She treads over to the window and opens it up to clear out her mum's sick breath circulating throughout the room. The river shimmers. It is very low, but at least there is some water. Last time she was here, it was bone dry. The skin of the water buzzes and cracks, licking the air, tasting the storm which is to come. She sits on the bed beside her mother. Juna looks like she's asleep, sipping air in and panning it out. Clear plastic tubes catch the light, dripping fluid into her wrist from the machine next to the bed. She looks soft, fragile, too different. From her eyes, Gracie projects her sorrow onto her mother. Unspoken words of regret and sorry business dance in the space between their faces. The heart monitor beeps steady. Juna's white hair has grown out in thin, soft wisps, barely hiding the skin of her scalp. Baby hairs are stuck down on her damp face, forming spit curls that frame her creased brown face in translucent waves. Her dowth of hair accentuates her fragile neck and round skull. "Same haircut as me, eh, Mum?" Gracie's fingers brush through Juna's hair, mussing up the smooth nap and combing out moisture from the soft cotton wool. Detritus falls from her scalp like dust from an old book. Juna's hair frizzes and floats. I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. I'm going to clap so there's some noise after that. You can hear the classroom as well. That's great. Excuse me one moment. Okay, there I am. Okay, so Mykaela, you're joining us as part of the unit Writers at Work. So we're interested in what sounds like a basic question, but actually is taking us a long time to explore. And that's what is the work of writing? So I thought I might start with that. What is the work of writing to you? Is it different now to when you started, do you think?
Yes. So now I know that the work of writing is mostly rewriting and editing. I think when I first started, I thought that, you know, things came out perfect, more or less, the first try, and then you just needed a little bit of tinkering. But when I look back over, you know, some of the best things that I wrote, it's a very labor-intensive process. it might come out more or less fully formed in the shape that it's going to end up in, but it needs a lot of work. I liken it to being a sculptor. You start out with this raw material, which is like a big chunk of words that you just get out as quickly as possible. And then it's a matter of moving things around and taking things away and adding things until it's perfect, which it never is because you're a writer and you've got to keep tinkering. So yeah, for me, that's the main labor of writing. But then there's all these other attached things that come with the job, which are admin things, like administrative tasks, like answering emails, sending invoices, organizing things. And also, like, built into that administrative stuff is the building of relationships, because even though as a writer you're such a solitary worker, to get your work published and promoted, you're working with other people and you need to have good relationships with them. And so that's built into it too. I think, what else is part of the labor of writing for me? Yeah, mostly the rewriting, that's the big chunk of it. And then, yeah, a lot of the editing. For me, the first draft doesn't ever take that long. I'm pretty good at just getting it out, but it's the making it perfect that takes a while. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all in that sentence. It's the making it perfect that takes a while. It was interesting what you said then about the work of writing being about relationships too, because that is partly about a lot of people make it happen. So a lot of people get it from you to people who are going to read it. But it's also maybe, I don't know what you think about this, it becomes clearer and clearer that you can't survive this work on your own. I don't mean to suggest that it's cruel work, but I mean that to sustain yourself, you need to talk to other people about what this work involves, about your worries about craft and so on. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so when I first started creative writing, I was lucky enough as part of my degree at Sydney Uni to take 2 classes. One was they were both in 2017. The first one was with Fiona McFarlane, who's amazing, and it was a workshop class on the short story. And the second class was with Beth Yup, and that was a class on like longer form writing, but they were both workshop classes. And it was my first time being in that environment and working with other students and listening to them and sharing like really rough drafts and, talking about that. So that was new to me. But since then, I haven't actually been able to access that really. Later on in my degree, I had the wonderful eyes of my supervisors, Dr. Peter Minter and Dr. Vanessa Berry, who is here, who read my stories in their very early, quite rough drafts, and, were really encouraging. But, I guess what I'm trying to say is I've had these periods where I've been able to access that stuff, in terms of craft, but for a lot of it, it's been figuring it out myself. And the best way I've been able to do that is by being really critical of my own work, reading a lot and editing my stuff as though it's somebody else's work, and just being really, pedantic with it. But I draw on the wisdom from my classes that I took, and I draw on the wisdom from Vanessa and Pete, who, their comments and their suggestions still kind of live up here. And I sometimes I hear the voices, those 4 voices of 4 amazing writers in their own right while I'm editing. It's pretty nice. But I also hear my own voice, which is a lot stronger and a lot more critical. Because let's face it, your teachers do have to be a bit nicer. They have to be quite gentle in their feedback. But yeah, I don't know. What am I trying to say? I've definitely had that help. wish I could have taken more classes because I really love them. I'm really jealous of all of you watching this right now. I'm sure you get to do this a lot and get to share your work and listen to others, and I just think it's really cool. And yeah, you should make the most of it, because I only got to take 2 classes and I wish I could have taken more.
Yeah, I do think there are periods in your life, if you're lucky, you get to access this stuff, and it's kind of intense. But what you're talking about there, you can hear their voices in your head. If you're lucky again, the model that you experience in workshop and with good mentors carries on in your work. It gives you a way of looking at it, and it's good. It's good you've got the gentle voices of my colleagues in your head to balance you being more critical. But I wanted to ask you about your new collection that is imminent. And to introduce it, I might just read Professor Janine Lian's amazing quote. In This All Come Back Now, Saunders commits a radical act of subversion and intellectual sovereignty by transforming a genre that has defined Western attitudes towards race, colonialism, and technology into a vehicle of First Nations continuance, resilience, and resistance. So I wanted to ask you, with that as context, how the collection came to be, what it is you've made here, what you wanted to make, what your hopes were for this book.
Okay, so the anthology itself very naturally grew out of my doctorate research. So for my doctoral research, I was writing stories that are set in the future in my community. They all feature my Aboriginal community in different versions of the future. And I'd just been reading and writing and thinking about speculative fiction for years, very intensely. And I'd read a couple of North American spec fic anthologies, Indigenous anthologies, and I just really wanted one to exist for our own people. I just really wanted it to happen, and I kind of waited. I was hoping that someone else would do it, because I am an absolute blow into this. There are other scholars who have been doing this a lot longer than me, but I don't know, I just decided one day, all right, I'm going to have a go at it. And so I applied for some funding through OzCo, and I got rejected. And that just made me more determined. So I took the application. This is also part of the labour of writing. If you don't come from money like I do, you have to apply for funding. So for my app, I reworked it and I just made it a lot stronger than it was. And I got the funding eventually. And I worked with people at UQP, particularly Aviva Tuffield, who I've had a relationship with for a little while. And they loved it. I got it done pretty quickly. It was in my last year of my doctorate. I probably should have not taken it on then because I had a lot on. But, when you get funding for something, you have to kind of do it, don't you? So, yeah, I put the call out. I solicited submissions. I emailed writers, people I already had a relationship with and people I just didn't know yet. And a lot of them got back to me. Some of them couldn't do it. Some of them could. And then I just started reading and choosing. And then, the collection started to form and suggest a kind of a bigger shape to me. And then what? And then I chose the stories. I went through a structural edit with each of the writers. So there was 20 other writers. Some of the stories are actually excerpts of things that have already been published. So they didn't really need too much, just maybe a little polish here and there. But there were other stories that they needed a bit of work. Like I could see the potential in them, but they needed work. And I flagged that with the writers, before I chose it. Excuse me. I just asked if they were up for an intensive edit, and they all were. And, it was a pretty intensive process, but it was worth it when the stories came out, shining. And then what else? I'm trying to think about what the next steps were. Once I'd kind of done my job, I handed it over to UQP. I commissioned an artwork from an artist who I really admire, Jessica Johnson at Nungala Creative. And then UQP went through their kind of copy edits with everything. And yeah, am I missing anything? I don't know. Was there another part to that question?
I don't know, but I've got more now because you've made me think more. So had you been an editor before? I mean, this is often part of the work of writing as well, editing other people's work. How did you find that experience?
I found it really nice, actually. It was a part of the process where you're able to build a relationship with another writer through a document. And there were some writers who, I didn't know before, but now, through this process, we've got a relationship, and it's quite nice. Obviously some writers are a bit more resistant to things. Sorry. While other writers are like quite open to things, it's just different with every writer. I had never edited anyone else's stuff before. I've always had, speaking of voices in the head, I always had one of Beth Yarp's little bits of wisdom in my head. She always told us that when editing work, you want to go in as though you're walking on snow and not leave your footprints behind, or something like that. I'm probably bastardizing it, but I just always remembered that. And as someone who's had my work published in anthologies, and I've worked with other editors, and some of them are really hands-on and some are really hands-off, and some are quite a bit meddly, and some are, it's as though they like are not reading your work at all. I wanted to kind of strike a happy medium but between it all. Like, I wanted to show the writers that like I care about making the stories the best they could be, but not changing their voice or meddling too much in the story unless there was some kind of glaring inconsistencies or something like that.
Yeah. I always think that editing is a really useful exercise because you take it back to your own work as well. It teaches you to see things from a distance, and then you can sort of be quite businesslike with yourself about your writing as well. Can I ask you what else you've been working on, Mykaela?
Well, at the moment, I'm working on, so I wrote, as part of my doctorate degree, I wrote a short story collection, and I've just taken it out for the first time since I submitted months ago, and I'm editing those stories because I want to try and shop the manuscript around. And I've given myself this deadline by the end of this week. So I've been doing that all month, and that's been basically all I've been doing. And it's really torturous because last year when I handed my thesis in, I thought my stories were amazing. They were perfect. They were great. But a few months later, with fresh critical eyes, I can see that there's quite a bit of work that needs doing. And I've been working on them pretty hard because I want to get that done by Friday, because next week my book comes out and I want to enjoy that. I want that to be a clear run with no deadlines and no stresses. And yeah,
absolutely. You'll do it. You're a doer, Mykaela. Where would you say that your love of stories comes from?
Oh, I just grew up in a family of people who, can I swear, they just absolute shit talkers. Like, just always telling stories, particularly my Uncle Kev, my stepdad, my Uncle Kev, who's Aboriginal, my stepdad, who's Aboriginal and South Sea Islander, my mum, who's Aboriginal, my dad. I didn't grow up with my dad and that side of the family, but I visited them a lot, and they're all Lebanese, and they're just all big storytellers too. So everyone, and I just really worshipped always worship people who could tell a good yarn, and I still do. Actually, my partner is one of the best. All my best friends are people who just tell really good stories. It's just something that I'm really attracted to in life. And I guess I just want to be like these people I admire, so I think I've always been pretty good at telling stories because I learned from the best. But as far as writing them down goes, I enrolled in my doctorate degree in 2017 because I wanted to learn how to write fiction. And and it's been the best thing I ever did. I'm so glad I did it.
That's really good news. What do you think stories are for, Mykaela? Do they have a purpose?
I mean, yes, they do. They have many purposes. I think just like any art form, they can, I think, mainly to entertain, to make us feel good, to make us feel something. But also there can be these kind of deeper, I guess, moral or ethical, considerations. But the more I write and the more I write new stuff, particularly, I'm coming to find that starting a work just with ethical or moral or political considerations doesn't always make it the most entertaining. And I see that in some of my earlier writing because I'm writing from an Aboriginal standpoint, and I want to tell the truth about our history and our futures in my stories, but they can come off a bit didactic and heavy-handed, and that's not necessarily good writing or good fiction writing. So I think if I'm writing an essay or something, that kind of stuff can belong in there. But with fiction, for me, where I'm at now, and this can probably change because I change my mind all the time, I think stories are there to kind of entertain us and to move us and to get into our heads and our hearts, but not necessarily to lecture people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about the way it's a kind of family connection, the way that you learn that. And George Saunders talks about the way, everybody was kind of wise talking and telling stories. You had to be funny, it was currency. And it's a kind of glue sometimes in families and communities. And what you were saying about, I wanted to try that. And that's what reading is for me as well. It's just like, oh my God, I want to go at that, It's like, I guess it's like picking up a violin, or, how do you make that happen? That's the stuff. So I'm just going to alert the room here and the Zoom room, just as we sort of come up to 1:30 hour. If you want to put any questions in the chat, if you want to sort of wave your hand at me in the room, I will I will stop talking and cede the floor, because Mykaela's here to talk to you. But I'll just ask you before that, Mykaela, about your path to becoming a writer, and whether there were any key moments of encouragement, discouragement. Are there moments you remember along the road that were important?
Yeah, so I think there's been a few. So I started out my public writing journey with a blog on MySpace many years ago, and I used to review albums and gigs and just nights out with my friends, and I just really enjoyed it, and all my friends really enjoyed it too. And it wasn't public, but it was shared amongst my friend group. And a few years later, one of my friends started a music magazine, and he used to read my blog, and he asked if I would like to write and, interview bands for his magazine. And I said yes. So I got to start doing that. So the encouragement from my friends was the first thing. And then that leading on to this job, I only did a few articles, by the way, before I moved overseas, but having that kind of validation in a magazine was really cool for me. And I got to speak to a couple of artists who I really admire. So there was that. And then from that, because it's all connected, of course, like encouragement leads to, you pushing yourself, which leads to more encouragement. So after that, I started a blog it was just a WordPress blog. And same thing, I would just review albums. I would also start to like do these weird rants. And because it was totally anonymous, I didn't have my name or photos to it. I could be really free with it in a way that I couldn't with my old MySpace stuff. So I was just writing really weird stuff, trying to be a bit creative. I didn't know anything about fiction or craft. I was just writing what I felt. And I wrote something, I wrote a piece called But You Don't Look Aboriginal in 2014, and it went viral. And I mean, back then, when I say viral, it was at the dissolution of my blog a few years later, there was like 9,000 shares and, you know, all these comments, which was huge for me. It was, and that was really validating, but it was also terrifying as well, because my voice went around the world. I had a lot of people asking me to write more stuff, and it kind of freaked me out a bit because I didn't want to be known for anything. I just wanted to write and not have anyone perceive me. Anyway, so that was that bit. And then a few years later, I'd been reading a bit of spec fic. I was pretty dissatisfied with a lot of it because they all tended to like genocide Aboriginal people in the future. So I decided I wanted to start writing my own, and that's when I enrolled in my Doctor of Arts degree. And yeah, and then since then I've had a couple of nice, you know, little things, you know, where I've submitted stuff and had it accepted, or I've won prizes for things, which has been really nice, and all of that's really encouraging. But you know, the biggest encouragement is just when like people that you know and respect read your work and they tell you that. That's way nicer than anything else. Well, money's nice too because it helps you write more, but in terms of sticking with you, that feedback's really nice.
Yeah, I think that's it. The people you respect, saying that you are worthy of respect for this work that you've done is awesome. Okay, are there any questions in the room? Yes, we have a question from Ryan.
Sort of similar to that, how do you find when you're speaking about very similar, that new genre in terms of this is towards the industry, towards publishers and people.
What? So how do you explain? How do you articulate that? Yeah. Okay. You probably can't hear Mykaela. So Ryan asks. So you've got this innovative genre of Aboriginal speculative fiction, and so how do you articulate that to a writing world that has no experience of this new thing?
Well, I did it in my introduction. So, but if you're not going to, if you want me to summarize that, or I'm going to find that really hard because my introduction is actually about 5,000 words long.
Yeah.
So it took me, it's a good question. It did
how many words it takes
to kind of unpack it and to like locate it in its lineage and its history and who's been doing it. But look, Aboriginal speculative fiction is it's speculative fiction written by Aboriginal people, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've got a Torres Strait Islander writer in the anthology. It's, you know, any genre of speculative fiction, whether it's ghost stories or bush horror or, you know, magic realism, fantasy, futurism, all the kind of weird genres that aren't considered realism. You know, that's all speculative fiction. And Indigenous spec fic written by Indigenous people, usually, you know, it's usually grounded in our realities. So we're not always necessarily looking to colonize other planets. You know, for example, we're more thinking about what colonization did to us and how, you know, how our stories have survived throughout that. I'm probably not explaining that really well, am I? So what is Aboriginal spec fic? It is, yeah, it can be any of that stuff. It's usually for me, reading all of these stories and studying it over the years, for me, the biggest thing about it is that while speculative fiction has, generally been pretty racist and sexist and just pretty gross over its history, like spec fic in general, Aboriginal spec fic tends to use those tools, those spec fic tools, as our own, to kind of tell our stories, whether they're set in the future or in alternate versions of the present or the past, and for our cultures, like a lot of our old stories deal in spec fic themes anyway, such as time travel, magic, technology and sciences, and our stories just still use those even in contemporary spec fic reckonings, so it's not like it's new to us. We're just using it in more, I guess, contemporary ways, especially in this book.
Thank you, Mykaela. I think we've got another question in the chat. So you mentioned when you were first writing, you didn't put your name to it and could be free with your writing, and that back then you knew less about fictional craft. Now that you know a whole lot about craft, would you say you are still free in your writing? Thank you, Gabrielle. Good question.
That's a good question, Gabrielle. Thank you. So I think the reason I was free back then was because, I wasn't thinking about craft or whether I was any good. I was just doing it. But I think I'm still free in my writing. They say to write for an audience, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm writing a piece about it, actually. I used to say, I write for my community, I write for my friends, I write for, the people who are close to me. But the more I write and the more I think about it, I'm really only writing for myself. And that's what makes me really free. When I'm writing for a deadline or a submission, whether that's a competition or, a publication, I'm often thinking about who's on the other end of that. And let's be honest, the person on the other end of that is often a middle-class white person who's very different to me. And that to me can be a little bit paralyzing in the way I write. So my preferred way of writing now is to just write for myself, to write what I like, to write things that I enjoy, that I find funny, that I find, entertaining. And if someone likes it at the end of that, that's great. But if not, if I'm just writing, towards a deadline or for an outcome, I don't think my writing's very free and I don't like it. So try not to write that way anymore. Yeah.
Thank you, Mykaela. I might just ask one and then I'll see what our students have got. I was reading, this wasn't for class, so the class hasn't read this, but I read your review of Chelsea Wattego's, it's Another Day in the Colony, isn't it? Called Skin, and your review was called Skin in the Game in the Sydney Review of Books. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And something that I really enjoyed about the review was the way that I think several times you described the embodied experience of reading, and that's not something that I would often see in a review, if ever. So I was wondering about that experience of the body when we read. If you could tell us about that, and possibly the experience of the body when we write as well, because these are things that we're not used to thinking about.
Well, I think about them a lot, actually. I'm someone who, if I'm not comfortable in my body when I'm writing, it's not going to come. When I started writing a few years ago, I was living in my van and I would park up at various headlands or nice spots, and I would lay in the back of my van. I'd be very comfortable. I'd have the laptop on my knees and I would just, write, or handwriting, laying on the floor. So when I was kind of started trying to use a desk, I found it horrible. I can't write at a desk. I can't do it. I have a desk. I bought my first desk in my whole life last year, a few months ago. I use it to put things on. I still prefer to sit in my beanbag or in my bed or in my van and write, because I need to be really comfortable, because you need to get into this really intense kind of space. And for me, that's just being comfortable. My body's just not trained to sit at a desk. And so that's the writing part of it. And I think with reading, it's similar too. Like I love reading in bed. Like I love going to bed early. I'm such a nana. I love going to bed early and reading. It's often the only uninterrupted reading time I get. You know, during the day, as much as I would like to block out time for reading, there's always other stuff to do, emails, writing. And I can never really sometimes I can't justify sitting and reading for pleasure. But when I can get into bed, my computer's not there. I don't take my phone into the bedroom, and it's just me and the book. And I really love that. Back to the review of Chelsea Watergo's book, which I really loved, you know, but so many books, I mean, that book, more than so many other books, did do something to me physically. You know, I felt a real affinity with some of the things that she spoke about, because as an Aboriginal person working in Aboriginal education for 20 years, these are the things that my body knows and remembers, the things that she was speaking about. And I did, you know, I cried through the book. I laughed through the book. I felt really angry through the book when I thought about certain things in the light she was framing them. And I don't get that with a lot of books, you know. So, I mean, some, you know, really move me, some make me laugh, but this one, I think because it really cut to the bone, a lot of it was a really embodied experience for me, more so than a lot of other books. And I think that's why I was compelled to write the review of it, you know.
Yeah, I love the presence of that in the review. I thought it was, it just seemed like something new to me. I enjoyed it very much. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Kim, I think. You mentioned in your intro that the first step is just getting the words down, but how do you know when the words, rough as they might be, are enough to take further, right? So, for example, how much of a perfectionist should one be for that first draft? Thank you. Thanks, Kim. Good question.
I mean, I think it's a pretty good question. I think you have to really trust yourself. Like if you've written a first draft and you read it and you see potential in it, it excites you, you feel proud of it, then keep going. If it feels a bit rubbish, just leave it, maybe come back to it later on, and you might get those feelings again. You know, we all have those feelings where you've been working on something and you absolutely hate it. It's the worst thing you've ever done. It's the worst thing anyone's ever done. And you're the worst person and you're the worst writer and all that. Sometimes the best thing is just to leave it for a while and come back to it. I'm personally not really a perfectionist with the first draft. I handwrite everything first. So because it's not on the screen and I can't delete, I'm not actually thinking about what words are down. I just write it and I follow each sentence to its logical conclusion. Then I start the next sentence and I just keep going that way. My handwriting's so messy and I write so fast that I don't even know what I've been writing. I have to go back and reread it to go, okay, that's where it is. And then, you know, and then usually I'll type it up, and as I'm typing it, I'm editing it, and that's the first edit. But yeah, look, I think in terms of a first draft, like it depends if you're just writing as an exploratory type of activity, if you're just writing to see what you think about something, or like, you know, testing out ideas for stories or scenes, and it excites you, then keep going with it. But if not, just change track, you know, or come and revisit it with fresh eyes. I think your gut is your biggest teacher, you know, and you have to be, I think, to have a really good gut feeling about things, you have to be really critical of reading and writing. So you have to read really widely, and then you can figure out what you like and what you don't like, and then you can judge your own writing on those terms as well. So yeah, I think you have to be really critical to be a good writer.
But it's a kind of critical distance, I reckon, that needs to be fair on yourself as well. I mean, there are days when I probably just need to get more sleep before I look at my work. You know, you can take it too personally, I think. It's that what you say about reading really chimes for me about learning that kind of a kind of sharp critical reading that is not self-damaging, because if you can't separate yourself from what you've written and you turn that critical voice on yourself, you can lose work that had something. You know, you have to be generous as well to allow for possibility.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I'm also going to add that I've had almost 20 years of working with students and marking papers, and I'm always been very generous in my marking, not creative writing marking, you know, usually with essays. And so I apply that to myself as well. Nothing's ever thrown out totally. There's always something salvageable. There's always something I can be kind and generous about. Even if you don't feel like it, there's always something there, you know.
Yeah, you're not always up to it. I'm just going to check in the room. We've got some in the chat. Were there more questions in the room? I don't remember your question exactly, Caitlin. Oh, okay, so Caitlin asks whether non-First Nations writers should include First Nations characters. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, it really depends on what you're writing. Like, I think if you're just doing it to tick a box, probably not, because it's you know, it will come off as tokenistic. But if you're writing a story where, you know, there is a presence of, you know, First Nations characters or history, and, you know, it demands it, then yes, you absolutely should, because then leaving it out is actually a problem too. So I mean, this is stuff that we're reckoning with as a community, as a nation, as hundreds of nations actually at the moment. And there's a lot of other Aboriginal writers who've, you know, written great things on this. A lot of even Indigenous and Black writers from like globally who've written on this. I'm not really an expert. I will say I've read a lot of, you know, fiction where Aboriginal characterization is just really terrible for whatever reason, whether it's racist or it's just flat or it's childish. But it's also like I've also read so many stories where I think that, you know, the community or characters need to be acknowledged, and yeah, I think that doesn't happen a lot. So no easy answer, I'm sorry, but we have not had an easy history here. So, you know, that's what's to be expected.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Mykaela. All right, let's just have a look in the chat. So Vanessa Berry, who you know, says, congratulations on this all come back now. It's a treat to hear you reflect on your process and development as a writer. A question about voice, imagination and process. How do the voices of something and in your stories, I'd say it's your characters, maybe?
Voices of my stories and in my voices, I would say. Yes, I get it. Thank you, Vanessa.
It's all right, Vanessa. We're going to freelance with it.
It's so nice to chat, even though we're in front of lots of people. A question about voice, imagine and processes. So voice is an interesting one for me, and it's a battle that I've actually had with editors before, and it's probably a battle I'm going to come up against and again. So I'm pretty staunch about this. So we all, like, not everyone, science has discovered that a lot of people have a voice that they hear in their head. It's a kind of running commentary on life. Some people don't have it, some people do. I do. My voice is an amalgamation of all of my elders and people in my family, all the people closest to me. So this voice is a very working class, a very dirty voice. It's a very funny voice. It often sounds like an old person just ranting on and on and on. And that's the voice when I'm writing that I tap into, and it just, that's the voice that I write in. When I speak, I'm always changing how I speak. So whether I'm talking to my Aboriginal family or my Lebanese family, or I'm talking to my students or whatever context, I'm always changing. But when I'm writing, that voice is constant, and it's very strong in my writing. I have a very particular, it's a very musical voice. It's a very cheeky voice. And I have had, I've had issues with editors before, sometimes trying to change the rhythm or the music of the voice to make it more clipped, maybe make it sound a bit more proper or middle class. And I've recognized what they're doing, because to them, voices like the one in my head they're not really around in fiction, or they don't belong in fiction. But I try and push back on that as much as possible. That said, I am very open to editing. It's just when I recognize that it's about voice and language, which is often a class issue, I'm very like about it. So yeah, voice is probably the strongest thing when I'm writing. It's, it's the thing I tap into, and that voice starts to tell the story, and the voice comes out in the characters. And I love writing dialogue. It's really fun, So, yeah.
Thanks, Mykaela. Another person who Aviva Tuffield, is here and has a question for you. So Mykaela has won prizes for fiction and non-fiction and poetry. Yes, she's multi-talented. She is spruiking you to the rest of us. Thank you, Aviva. Do you know, Mykaela, when you've had an idea, whether it will be a story or an essay or even a poem, or do you think about form you want to write next, say for competition, and then the idea follows? I see. So which way round do things?
Yeah, I write in my journal most days, and sometimes that an idea will come out of that, and and then I'll type it under the computer and I'll think it's a story, and it might be a poem. And I never actually, no, that's a lie. Sometimes I sit down and go, I'm going to write a story about this. Like, I have a short story collection that I'm very slowly working on called With Teeth, and all the stories are like satirical and absurdist, and they all come from ideas more than like characters or plot. So for them, those stories, when I sit down to write scenes for them, yes, I'm very consciously writing stuff, but sometimes things just pour out of me and I don't know where it's going to end up, and I don't know for what. As for like writing for submission, I've stopped writing things from scratch for submissions. If an opportunity comes along and I've already got something that I've written, like a half draft or an idea, and I've already started on it, maybe I'll think about developing it. But as far as writing something from scratch to that, I just don't really have time, and the odds are never good enough for you to justify spending all that time on it. I've got to work, I've got to, if we're coming back to the theme of the class, I've got to work, and to justify all the hours that you have to spend making a piece of writing so amazing that it's going to get anywhere in a competition, let alone win. You have to, I think it's best to already start with something you've already got. Yeah.
Thank you. I muted us at this end because before the end of class, some neighbours take up a position in the room next door and they start singing and clapping.
Oh, that's nice.
So it always gets quite lively at the end of class. I was wondering, Mykaela, if you could perhaps read to us from the introduction to your new collection so we can get a flavour.
Yes. So I've got a couple of little sections I could read from, but I'm not going to read from the beginning, but I might read a little bit about the motivations of why I guess I get so passionate about this genre. So up until now, we have never had an anthology of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander speculative fiction, written and edited entirely by us, right? But why in this year of 2021, when I wrote the intro, is this a world first? Well, over the years that I've been studying Indigenous spec fic, I've had countless conversations with people interested in my work. One question I'm always asked is, why isn't there much Indigenous spec fic being written? But there is, I answer. We blackfellas love reading spec fic and writing our own. So a better question to ask is, why isn't there much Indigenous spec fic being published? Well, it is. It's just not being published in the places you expect. Anecdotally, many First Nations spec fic writers I've spoken to have had their work embraced by mainstream literary publishers after being rejected by Australian spec fic publishers. Indeed, of all the stories in this anthology that have been previously published, none of them come from traditional Australian spec fic publications. They were all first published in mainstream literary publications, and a few of them have even won lucrative literary prizes. To be fair, there aren't many spec fic publishers in Australia, but those that do exist have historically not published much of our writing. Some might say that this is a matter of taste, as though taste is objective and just a matter of style or aesthetics. But taste is judgment, which determines the way we read, enjoy, and interpret stories. And this is always, always shaped by our worldviews, which are always cultural. Of the many spec fic stories about First Nations characters and cultures, the vast majority have been written by non-Indigenous writers and published through traditional Australian spec fic channels. It's gotten a little better recently, mostly, but there's a long way to go still, considering that for most of its history, the Australian spec fic publishing industry has been hostile to our stories and indeed our presence, while mining our cultures and pillaging our spirituality to trade in tired themes and tropes. Australian and global spec fic prizes have too been historically averse to actual First Nations writers, but very welcoming of non-Indigenous writers who win awards for biting our style and flogging our experiences for their storylines. This is still true at the time of writing, unfortunately. No wonder we feel hostile to the Australian spec fic community too. I don't say any of this lightly or pithily or to provoke a controversy for the sake of the discourse. I'm saying this with my whole chest, hand on heart. I say this with the authority of somebody who has sought out and read every single Australian spec fic story that features at least one Aboriginal character. And I say this loud and clear. The vast majority of this characterisation is no good, whether they're infantilizing or fetishizing or assimilating or demonizing us, or some combination of these. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mykaela. It's getting really rowdy here because I think there's a sort of a vibe in the air to celebrate you and your achievements.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your readings. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for your questions and your presence. Apologies for my coughing. Hopefully that clears up soon.
Yeah, rest your voice. Rest your voice in time for the Sydney Writers Festival.
Yes.
And good luck with finishing your stories.
Thank
And
you.
it's always wonderful to hear what you're up to. Go well. We'll see you soon. Thank you,
Thank you.
Mykaela.
Bye everyone. Thank you.